This week, we're taking a look at informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are those fallacies that can only be discovered by looking at the content or the what is said of an argument. I'm going to switch to a presentation and talk over it a little bit and walk you through the ins and outs of the basics of informal fallacies. Let's review. We don't want to forget our premise indicator words or our conclusion indicator words from Chapter 1. These will help us find the premises and the conclusions of different arguments. Not every argument has these, so these are just indications of what a premise or a conclusion might be. But it'll be helpful when identifying a fallacy to know the conclusion and to know the premises. We also want to talk about the difference between formal fallacies and informal fallacies. This week we're looking at informal fallacies, and there are a lot. Technically, there are not as many as there are formal fallacies because there are infinitely many formal fallacies. But we only give names to a few, and we'll get to that. But we've already seen affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. And if you recall, modus ponens was a valid form of argument, so it's not a fallacy at all. But affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent are. Informal fallacies are so named because you can't tell that an argument commits a fallacy just because of its form. You have to know a little bit about its content. And there are two kinds of informal fallacies. There are fallacies of irrelevant premises and fallacies that have unacceptable premises. Arguments are supposed to provide you relevant pieces of information that support the conclusion. When they don't do this, and the mistake they make is very common, we often give them names. These are the informal fallacies of irrelevant premises. Premises can have relevant pieces of information, but still be unacceptable. When an argument has an unacceptable premise, and it's very common, we'll give it a name, and these will be the informal fallacies of unacceptable premises. Let's look at an example of the first kind, a fallacy of irrelevant premises. This fallacy is called the fallacy of composition. And the general form of it is that what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. Here's an example. Each player on this team is the best. Therefore, the team is best. If you follow sports, you know the fallacy very well. Very often, we might have a Ryder Cup team that has all the world's best golfers on it, and they might still lose in international competition, and so would not be the best team. We might put together an all-star team that has all the best players on it, but they could still lose to another team. So just because the parts have a property, namely being the best in this case, does not mean the whole has that property. It could have that property, but if a whole has a property, it isn't just because the parts have that property. That is fallacious. Here's an example of a fallacy of unacceptable premises. So in this case, the premises are relevant, but they're still unacceptable. We're going to look at the fallacy called slippery slope. You are to imagine a snowball rolling down a hill, right? As it picks up snow, it's going to get bigger and bigger. And very often, people will argue without good reason that taking a first step will inevitably lead to a much more serious or undesirable final step. If we legalize same-sex marriage, then next thing you know, people will be asking to marry their pet dolphins. Therefore, we should not legalize same-sex marriage. This, in addition to being ridiculous, is an example of the fallacy of slippery slope. The arguer is claiming that the first step, legalizing same-sex marriage, will inevitably lead to some undesirable final step, people marrying their pet dolphins. But of course, there's no good reason to think that. So that's a bad argument. Your book has many more. Here's your tip. First, look at the information provided in the premises and decide whether you think it's relevant or not relevant to the truth of the conclusion. If it's not relevant, it might be one of our fallacies. If it is relevant, but it still seems problematic, it might be one of our fallacies of unacceptable premises. And we should also note that an argument can still be bad even if there isn't a named fallacy in our text corresponding to the mistake. In general, we're going to ask whether the information provided gives us good reason to believe the claim made in the conclusion. Thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion forum.